Each survivor is trying to find their own way back to humanity. At this pop-up healing center outside Tel Aviv, dozens of therapists have volunteered to help.
The few people that came on the first day were hollow. It was like death was all around them.
Here, they're slowly learning to feel safe in their bodies and minds again, their souls, and to dance to the music they went to share in love, but ended in hell.
So much evil. They saw so much evil and so much darkness. And for a lot of them, it's hard for them to get back to life or to feel that they're allowed to be happy in other places. But here, it's healthy and it's healing and it's life.
But in a country where everyone has been touched by this tragedy, are not yet ready to begin healing. When Evan closes his eyes at night, the images play over and over.
What I see is not normal people. I see it was not one, it was not an eye, it was not a mouse, it was not... And I wake up every day for the last month. This is what I...
Tomorrow, Evan is being deployed to fight in Gaza. His battle is far from over. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Layla Milana Allen in Haifa.
Now we'll look at an illness that's dangerous for babies, made worse by a shortage of drugs to treat it. Amna is back with this report reported earlier.
Among children under the age of 5, RSV leads to as many as 80,000 hospitalizations and up to 300 deaths a year. It's the number one cause of hospitalization for infants under a year old. Dr. Celine Gounder is an epidemiologist and senior fellow at KFF. She also hosts the podcast Epidemic, Eradicating Smallpox. Celine, it's good to see you. And let's just start with what it is that makes RSV so dangerous for young children in particular. What does it do to their systems?
Well, RSV, or really any viral respiratory infection, leads to inflammation in the airways, which can lead to mucus, could lead to thickening of the lining of the airways. And between the two of those, you can get blockages of the airways, especially in young infants who have smaller airways to begin with.
So there are approved drugs to treat it. They're available as shots. There is this nationwide shortage. Is high demand the sole reason for that shortage? And if so, can we boost supply?
There is a new monoclonal antibody that's delivered as a shot. Its brand name is Beyfortus, that is new this season to help protect the youngest of infants. The challenge is really manufacturing, and based on what I've been told by the CDC and pharmaceutical companies, the supply that we have available right now is the supply that we're going to have available for the season. It simply just takes too long to manufacture more to have more available this season.
So that shortage has now led the CDC to issue guidelines saying who should be prioritized. Who are they saying should get those shots first, and who does that leave out?
So the youngest of infants, so those under the age of 6 months, as well as other infants who might have underlying medical conditions that predispose them to severe RSV, and pediatricians can help parents figure that out. There are alternatives. So there's an older monoclonal antibody against RSV called Synagis that is also effective in protecting infants, and that is being recommended for those between the ages of 8 and 19 months as an alternative. And then there's a third option, which is to vaccinate pregnant women. Those pregnant women will then produce antibodies to the RSV vaccine and pass those on through the placenta and through breast milk to protect their infants in that way.
And what should we understand about the cost of all of these treatments too? Does that impact who is able to get it? Is it covered by insurance?
Well, under the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies do not have to cover this until a year after the initial recommendation. However, the big insurance companies are covering the RSV vaccine for pregnant women. So even already now, many pregnant women will have coverage. It's also been challenging, however, to educate obstetricians about the need to vaccinate pregnant women against RSV to help reduce some of the issues we're having with shortages with the other options for infants, and also educating pharmacists who work in pharmacies that it is perfectly safe to be vaccinating pregnant women and in fact should be the norm.
So a lot of parents are seeing the headlines about these shortages. We've been hearing about looming triple demics, right, coming in this next fall and winter season. What is your advice to them on how they should proceed, especially if their child isn't eligible under those CDC guidelines?
Well, if your child is not eligible, do talk to your pediatrician about Synagis. It is an alternative for the older infants. And then it's the common sense measures that we take to reduce the risk of infection, not just with RSV, but also with influenza, COVID, and other respiratory infections. So if you're sick, stay away from other people. If other people are sick, keep them away from your child to the best that you can. I know that can be challenging if a child is in daycare, for example. Masks do work. So if someone is sick and absolutely has to be around your child, maybe they're a caregiver, they should be wearing a mask to reduce the risk of transmission to your child. Hand washing is also an important piece of this. And then a way to reduce risk in general in various indoor spaces is open your windows, open doors if you can, or put in a HEPA air filtration unit to reduce the risk of transmission in that space.
You know, more broadly, when you look at this, the issue of demand being so high for a drug seems to go against the trend of vaccine hesitancy and, frankly, skepticism in science that we saw, particularly in the pandemic. How do you look at that?
I think there's a few things at play here. I think some parents really have seen whether it's their child or other young children get very sick from RSV, end up in the hospital from RSV, and so it's very real for them. I think another issue, though, is that COVID was politically politicized in a way that RSV has not been. And I think between those two different factors, we're seeing a difference in demand and uptake.
Dr. Celine Gounder, epidemiologist and senior fellow at KFF. Dr. Gounder, always good to see you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
As the war in Gaza continues, the Biden White House is facing fresh pressure over how to approach its relationship with Israel. On that and more, we turn to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. It's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. It's good to see you both. Good job. So, David, I'm going to start with your reaction to Israel agreeing to put in place 4-hour daily humanitarian pauses in its assault on Hamas in northern Gaza.
Yeah, I think it's a start. I think that Israel has to do a few things here. The first is obviously defeat Hamas. There can be no peace in the Middle East as long as Hamas is there. And so that's what you might call the near enemy. But the real enemy and the far enemy is Iran. And I was with a group of foreign policy experts last week, and one of them made a smart observation, which was of all the nations of the world, who's had the most effective foreign policy in the last several years? And it's been Iran. They've surrounded Israel with a bunch of terror groups, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas. And in order to defeat Iran, or at least stand up to Iran, you've got to have help in the neighborhood. And so you've got to have help in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and those regimes want to help you. They don't like Iran at all. But their populations are getting more and more furious about what's happening in Gaza. And so in order to defeat Iran and keep your allies with you, you've just got to be as humanitarian as possible. And so I think even aside from the moral reasons to spare the suffering of people in Gaza, there are strategic reasons Israel should be as humanitarian as possible.
Jonathan, when David talks about the moral and strategic reasons, the administration is pushing for a multi-day pause. And John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, said that these 4-hour-long pauses were a direct result of President Biden's contacts and conversations with Netanyahu.
Right. This is the public manifestation of hours, if not weeks, of private consultations. I was going to say lapel shaking, but of the president, the Secretary of State, and his shuttle diplomacy trying to impress upon the Prime Minister Netanyahu that you must have, if you're not going to do a ceasefire, which the administration is against, at least do a humanitarian pause. Gaza is suffering. There's no water, there's no food, there's no fuel, there's none of the basic necessities. You must defend yourself against Hamas, but you also must do so in a manner befitting a small d democratic nation. And so it'd be great if it were over several days, but the fact that there will be pauses over hours, it is the result of the president pushing Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the right thing, and hopefully that will lead to more.
What's your assessment of the way in which President Biden has navigated these competing interests and competing pressures?
Yeah, I think he's done quite well. I think the clarion call that Hamas has to be defeated. Hamas is a threat to the region. I think frankly, he might be alone in his administration in feeling that Strong not quite alone, but he's certainly been a force. And so I think he's put America and rallied the West into an idea that Israel, there was relative stability. It's not like Fatah. Hamas is something different, and I think one of the tragedies of what's happened in the last month is in a lot of people's minds that the difference between Hamas and Fatah has been elided. And Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, they recognize the state of Israel. They've been trying, to get to some sort of two-state solution. They play rough, and even in the Yasser Arafat days, there was terrorism, but often it was terrorism with the purpose of building leverage to get to a better settlement. Hamas is not like that. Hamas is about homicide. And it's about genocide, and it's about mass murder. And I think the president's been very clear about that. And it's because he's been doing this in the region for a long time. So I think this is a case where his age has really paid off.
Let's shift our focus to Tuesday night's election results. One thing was certainly clear, that abortion rights, reproductive rights, abortion access is politically popular no matter where it appears on the ballot post the Supreme Court overturning Roe. What were some of your other takeaways?
That was the main thing. Whether you are in a so-called blue state, but especially if you're in a red state. I looked at, let's just take Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia. He made it a point of saying, I will go for a 15-week abortion ban. Just give Republicans control in both bodies of the legislature, and I'll get it done. So on Earth 2, they plays well, because that's what they want. But the rest of us on Earth 1, and particularly suburban white women in the northern Virginia suburbs, looked at what happened with Dobbs and like, no. We've seen what has happened in other states around the country, particularly Florida, with the 6-week ban. We do not want that to happen here. Glenn Youngkin didn't get what he wanted in Virginia. Ohio Republicans didn't get what they wanted. Ohio, that Trump won by double digits, now has in its state constitution, Ruby Red, Ohio, access to abortion. Kentucky, Governor Beshear, reelected with that unbelievably powerful ad at the very end of the young woman who looked directly at the camera and blames David Cameron for wanting to institute a policy that would force her to carry her stepfather's child after he raped her. For Republicans who think that running on abortion is going to be the winning formula in 2024, Tuesday night should have been the wake-up call.
And David, you wrote a column this past week where the thesis was pretty evident based on the headline. It was Democrats, you can chill out now.
Yeah.
Why?
We go for subtlety.
Yeah, that's right.
At times. Right. Yeah, and it was an emotional roller coaster week. So in the beginning of the week, there's the Times Siena poll, which shows Trump in a bunch of battleground states, and Democrats are like, hair on fire, those who have hair. And then the election results come in, and yet again, as consistently since Donald Trump has been elected president, Democrats have a good night. And so one of my points was that the polls have to be looked at with a grain of salt. And not just because all polls have to be looked at with a grain of salt, because we're in a different culture now. Through most of our careers, presidential approvals go up and down. But over the last, since 2005, the country's been such a sour mood. Presidents have spent 77% of their time with their favorability ratings underwater. People just blame the president. So when a pollster calls them and people are upset with the country, they say, yeah, I'm against the president. They're venting. They're not voting. And so my point was, in this kind of climate, we have to understand that what people tell pollsters could be about how they feel, but it's not necessarily the decision they're going to make in a year.
Meantime, Democratic Senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, announced this past week that he's not going to seek re-election. In some ways, it's not surprising, given that it would have been really difficult, if not possible, for him to win re-election. But what's the impact on the Senate and on the party?
Well, the impact on the Senate is the Democrats are going to lose a seat that they pretty much thought that they were going to lose, and that was going to be a very tough re-election effort on Senator Manchin's part if he went for it. Most likely was going to lose. Immediately, it means that their chances of hanging on to the Senate just diminish because it's basically 50-50. And so that means that Senator Tester in Montana, Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio, at least it gives the party, the Democrats, more time, more energy, more money to focus on those races. But I would also say focus in on Texas and Congressman Colin Allred, who's looking to unseat Senator Cruz. Tough. That's going to be an uphill battle. Everyone thought that they were going to be the one. Beto O'Rourke thought he was going to be the one to be the next senator from Texas. But I think Congressman Allred could be that person, and Senator Manchin getting out maybe frees up some resources for the DNC to push his way.
What's the legacy that Joe Manchin leaves behind?
He saved the Biden administration. And so the Biden administration, if you remember a few years ago, wanted to spend $4 trillion to pump up the economy. And he said, no way, no way. It was more like $1 trillion. And as a result, if we had spent $4 trillion instead of $1 trillion, the inflation, which we really suffered from, would have been astronomical. And the Biden administration would be in much worse shape if our inflation had hit like double digits, which it could have, overstimulating to that degree. So Democrats don't like Joe Manchin, but he did save their bacon.
Before we wrap up, I want to put a marker on these latest comments from former President Donald Trump, who in an interview with Univision last night threatened to weaponize the DOJ against his opponents if he's reelected.
They've done indictments in order to win an election. They call it weaponization. And the people aren't going to stand for it. But yeah, they have done something that allows the next party. I mean, if I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them. Mostly that would be, they would be out of business. They'd be out. They'd be out of the election.
I spoke with Devlin Barrett, a Washington Post reporter, this past week, who not only reported that former President Trump wanted to do it, but that there are lawyers, conservative lawyers, who are putting together a plan and writing executive orders for how he
It's got a name. It's called Project 2025. Those plans, it's called the 180-day playbook. People who want to be a part of that administration, if it comes in, they can send in their resumes to that particular project. And what the president,
There's conservative lawyers who are putting together a plan and writing executive orders for how he could do it if he was reelected.
it's got a name. It's called Project 2025. Those plans, it's called the 180-day playbook. People who want to be a part of that administration, if it comes in, they can send in their resumes to that particular project. And what the former president said there, what he is saying are things he tried when he was president. Remember, at the very end of his administration, he was upset with Bill Barr because Bill Barr didn't move to arrest Joe Biden when Joe Biden was his political opponent.
Yeah, the word for it is authoritarianism, indicting your political opponent. And I do think there's another Republican or Trumpy plan, which would, right now in the federal government, there are 4,000 political employees in the government and thousands and thousands of civil servants. And there's a plan afoot to gut as many as 50,000 of the civil servants and replace them with partisan political people.
That's Schedule F.
Yeah, Schedule F. That would decimate our civil service, but it would also lead to apparently the complete politicization of the Justice Department. And so it's not just idle talk by Trump. There's actually plans afoot, as Jonathan said, to put this into effect, and that is truly scary.
David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, thanks as always.
Thank you.
Steve Waldman is the founder and president of Rebuild Local News, a nonpartisan nonprofit working to counter the collapse of local news and strengthen democracy. He's also the co-founder of Report for America. That's a national service program that places journalists in newsrooms across the country. Tonight, he shares his brief but spectacular take on how to rebuild local news.
Local news is in collapse. There's all sorts of evidence that when you don't have local news, you have lower voter turnout, more alienation, more polarization, people at each other's throats, more misinformation. I mean, it's really a terrible thing for communities to not have local news. On the community level, local news organizations are often unifying figures. They're the places where you have obituaries of interesting people who played an important role in the community, or the review of the community theater. The things in the community that tie them together are given voice through at least 1,800 communities right now don't have any source of local news. What we're finding is that when there's a vacuum, it gets filled by other types of information, often misinformation, or national news, which may be accurate but tends to be more polarized. Part of what happens when you consume news that is very partisan or national in nature is that you tend to think of your opponents as your enemies. Whereas when you have local news, you still have disagreements. Like, you might actually see that person at the Little League game or at the supermarket the next day, and you know they're a human being. We created Report for America to put reporters into communities to cover on local affairs. And the impact is amazing. I remember one in eastern Kentucky where the reporter got there, and it turned out that folks there were complaining for a long time about not having clean drinking water, and no one was paying any attention. And he just started writing stories about the drinking water, and before you know it, people in the state legislature were paying attention, and things like that happen all the time in communities throughout America, problems that aren't getting addressed because no one is watching the story. To solve this crisis, we need the commercial, local media sector to reform, get better at connecting with their communities, and be more locally owned. We're going to need philanthropy, large and small, to support community media. And then third, we're going to need some public policy help. It has to be done really carefully, but it can be done. At the end of the day, community journalism is not going to survive without the support of the community. And that can mean subscribing to a local newspaper, even if you don't love it. Subscribe to it, engage with it, tell them what they're doing wrong, but subscribe to it. I'm Steve Waldman, and this is my brief but spectacular take on how to rebuild local news.
You can watch more brief but spectacular videos online at pbs.org/newshour/brief. This Veterans Day weekend, Americans across the country will honor those who have served our nation in uniform. A new book explores and honors the legacy of two exceptional veterans whose contributions have gone largely unknown until now. Author Doug Melville recounts his family history and tells the barrier-breaking stories of father and son Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and Jr., the country's first black generals. He recently told me how watching the movie Red Tails, George Lucas's 2011 film about the Tuskegee Airmen, inspired him to write the book Invisible Generals, Rediscovering Family Legacy, and a quest to honor America's first black generals.
So I was invited to a screening, an advanced screening of the movie Red Tails. And when the commander of the Red Tails came out on screen, it was played by actor Terrence Howard. But while I was thinking that they were going to say Colonel Davis, who was commanding the Tuskegee Airmen, the name that they used was Colonel Bullard. I was quite upset about it. I went home. I tell my dad I was furious, and he said, "If you think changing the names are bad, why don't I tell you the full family story?" And he shared with me the story of the Invisible Generals. I was so inspired, Jeff, that I immediately said, I have to be the one to bring this story to the world so the true heroes can get their stories out into the universe.
And Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and Jr., obviously, they were father and son. And at the start of World War II, there were 335,000 Americans who were enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces. But there were only two black officers, the Davises.
Yeah, so Ben Davis Sr. In 1901 was elevated to officer by President McKinley. He then started his family. His wife dies in childbirth. He brings his son to go for a plane ride in a barnstorming traveling airplane exhibit. and he comes down from that ride and goes, "Daddy, I want to be a pilot." And Ben Sr. said, "I will help you live your dream." And that was when he started training Ben Davis Jr. to go through what it would take to graduate from West Point. Because of segregation, Ben Sr. knew that unless it was through graduating at the top of West Point, his son would never get the opportunity to live his dream. So he sells the family house in Washington, D.C., relocates to Illinois so he can get the signature of the only black congressman in the United States, Oscar DePriest, and then they enter West Point Military Academy without them knowing he was black. And this was in 1932.
And when Ben Davis Jr. was at West Point, he was obviously the only black cadet. He was ostracized. He was ignored as a matter of policy. How did he cope with that?
Well, this is really the mental fortitude and leadership that makes me feel he was the greatest general and greatest West Point grad of all time. When the cadets realized and the administration realized that they had let a black cadet into West Point, immediately they said, "We will silence him until he drops out." Ben Jr. called Ben Sr. and said, "Dad, I know they're going to silence me." And he said, "Son, there's 8 million blacks on the outside world that are rooting for you. Put a date on the wall of graduation in 1936, and no matter what anybody does to you, make sure you graduate at the top third of the class." 4 years went by. No human interaction outside the line of duty. No one talked to him. No one spoke to him. He couldn't eat at the tables with other cadets because he wasn't getting the permission to sit. Yet, he was able to still graduate in the top third of his class in the class of 1936.
And fast forward to the time when FDR was trying to get reelected. He called up Benjamin Davis Sr. for advice. And that is what gave rise to the Tuskegee Airmen. Is that right?
That's exactly right. FDR assigned Ben Davis Sr. as the head of Negro policy in the military so he could work with him directly. When asking Ben Davis Sr. how he could get the black vote, as he was the highest ranking black in the military, he said, "You must ensure equal opportunity for black and white Americans in the United States. And in the military, you must ensure equal opportunity by allowing blacks to fly airplanes," which at that time was not something that was allowed to do. And FDR told Ben Sr. who would lead that if that was something that I decided to do. And Ben Sr. said, "My son." His son would then go down to Tuskegee, and that would be the start of the Tuskegee Airmen that we all know and are familiar with.
That's incredible. Benjamin Davis Jr.
Well,
when he
syphilis.
retired from the military, he had just a consequential second act. Tell me more about that.
When Ben left the military in 1970, he couldn't get a job in the private sector as a pilot. No one would hire him because some of the evil segregation rules were still de facto in place in the private sector. So the government created a special assignment role in the Department of Transportation Aviation. And the first assignment